Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hans Visser. I'm the biodiversity officer with Fingal County Council, and I'd like to welcome all today to this webinar on the oyster restoration efforts in Dublin. The restoration of the marine environment is one of the priority actions in the Fingal Biodiversity Plan. And in terms of oysters, we actually used to have oyster beds along our coast and in several of the estuaries and in the marine environment. But due to pollution, overfishing, the oysters disappeared several decades ago. And I suppose the big question for us is now how to figure out how to get them back. So we've been working with UCD, with Paul Brooks, and with Brian Rice, who is here with us today, on figuring out as to how we're going to do this. Now, just I suppose in terms of general information, this webinar is recorded, so it will be made available through our website. And like if you have any comments or questions, we'll do a question and answer session at the end. But anytime during this presentation, you can also in the comments box you can actually put your questions in there already as well. So without any further ado, Brian, if you want to take over the presentation here.
Yep, sounds good there. Yeah, so my name is Brian Rice. I'm one of the PhD students at UCD under Dr. Paul Brooks. He sends his apologies for not being able to make it today. Came under the weather a bit, but he's sent on his slides. So I'll be presenting his slides for the first half, and then I'll go into a bit more detail with my project at the later half of the presentation there. But let me go ahead and switch over to my notes here for that. All right, so we're now calling ourselves here at UCD the Norwegian Group. So it's the Native Oyster Restoration and Ecology Action for Nature at UCD, just to give ourselves a little fancy title there. So we're going over kind of our team members here, just the background to the research that we're doing within our lab. And then we have 3 PhD students at the moment that are working on interconnected projects. So we'll go over briefly what the other 2 students are doing at the moment, but then the focus will be kind of on the oysters and some of that marine restoration work that we're doing right now is associated with my project. So as I said, we're led by Dr. Paul Brooks, who's our principal investigator on this. There's myself, Brian, working on oyster restoration. We have Victoria Jockless, who is a first-year student right now, working on combined restoration with oysters and seagrasses. And then Quiva Morris is another third-year student like myself, working on more eco-engineering related things around Dublin Port and a few other bays around the area. And then Jennifer Coughlin is our senior technician who helps out with all the field work and is fantastic. So a little background to the research, just growing human populations estimated that 50 to 70% of the global populations live within 100 kilometers of the coast. And as such, many of those coastal ecosystems are subject to a range of human pressures, including pollution, habitat destruction with industrialization, and of course, overfishing for food supply. So because of these pressures, it is now estimated that globally there's over an 85% decline of oyster reefs, and that's just across all oyster species, as well as 49% declines in seagrasses, which are often very, very closely related to oyster beds. And so what we're working on is some of those nature-based solutions, NBS for short, that address these societal challenges through actions to protect and sustainably manage those natural resources that benefit people and nature at the same time. So a lot of that kind of combined nature-based solution is the purview of Victoria's PhD. So she's going to be evaluating the nature-based solutions and how they can enhance and improve biodiversity and ecosystem services. So mostly she's going to be looking at the carbon capture and sequestration of seagrasses and the buffering capacities for predicted climate change scenarios. And she's looking at it at a combined restoration standpoint with oysters, since there has been some previous studies showing that when you combine that restoration with seagrasses and oysters together, they both actually produce a lot more benefits quicker when looking at some of those outcomes. And then another result of increasing the human population is that our natural shores are changing. So a lot of the coastal communities especially start this phenomenon called as ocean sprawl, where they don't just stop at the coastline, but they even start to build into those waters a bit. So you see a lot of those natural rocky shores begin getting replaced with artificial structures. You'll recognize a lot of these from around our coastlines. So this has some ecological consequences. The natural shores will have a higher complexity of just ridges and crevices. So there's more space and a lot of more natural substrate for animals and plants as well. Whereas the artificial structures will lower the complexity kind of with those smooth surfaces as opposed to the shells and rocks that you normally see. So there's a reduction of space there. And this can be built using unsuitable materials that are actually harmful for biodiversity in the long run. So Quiva's project there, our second PhD student, is looking at some scaled up approaches to eco-engineering. So using engineered solutions to reintroduce complexity to those coastline habitats, while also maintaining the function of a lot of the things that we as humans use them for. So she'll be testing the inclination of eco-engineered approaches with varying complexities and how this influences diversity and abundance, evaluating the efficacy of scaled up eco-engineering approaches, using these kind of special blocks along the intertidal and artificial seawalls, and evaluating whether these engineered habitats can benefit biodiversity on the intertidal rock armor structures. So it's kind of those bigger, bulkier blocks that you saw along the coast, usually going out to the lighthouse along the wall, using these kind of bigger blocks instead to give some complexity for biodiversity. And my project there is looking specifically at the native flat oyster. So this is looking at just characterizing our coastline to whether or not it's suitable for them to be restored here, experimentally testing artificial habitats and structures along the coastline to determine if this can enhance and kind of benefit the restoration efforts and kind of give them a better head start when we reintroduce them. And then once we have some oysters out there growing, evaluating their efficacy for actually increasing biodiversity and increasing those ecosystem benefits that they could present. So that's kind of Paul's deck that he shared there. So we'll be focusing a bit more on this project for the presentation for native oyster restoration around our East Coast here. So this is my project. So Paul Brooks and Tasman Crowe is also on there. It's a IRC-funded PhD with an enterprise partner with Dr. Robert Wilkes over at the EPA. So specifically working at the native Irish oyster / European flat oyster, Ostrea edulis. These are a bivalve mollusk that are distributed throughout the Northeast Atlantic, oval or pearl-shaped, live about 6 to 15 years, give or take, and are filter feeders. So that's one of the bigger ecosystem services that they can provide, is kind of filtering out a lot of those nutrients and other things that would cause those algal blooms that we see along our coastline. They're also very important and of interest to people because they are, of course, good to eat as well. You might know that Irish rock oysters are sought after a lot over the European continent. So, but mostly what they're having is Pacific oysters that we're growing here, but less so they're having the native flat oysters that used to be very, very abundant. So these matter because they can provide a lot of those ecosystem services, improving water quality, improving biodiversity, and adding to the natural shoreline protections for storms and erosion. And this species is fairly threatened. So they're down to about 5% of their historic population remaining throughout Europe. And it is a species that is definitely of importance for Irish heritage and fisheries. We have some pilot projects out there right now, and just everyone talks about all the fishermen that are still out there, talking about how they used to fish for oysters with their grandparents, but like they're just not really around anymore in lots of those areas. So there's a wide range of benefits that we can get from oysters. So it's good for local economy. It creates fisheries, jobs as well. And then there's more of the biodiversity aspects and ecosystem service aspects that we'll be focusing on for this project, but there is a wide range of benefits that can be bestowed from reintroducing these species. And it's actually being very widely studied throughout Europe. So there's an entire working group called NORA, which is the Native Oyster Restoration Alliance. So these are a sample of a lot of the projects that are happening throughout Europe. Ireland, we just have a couple going on. So we have our little pin there that's just been recently added to the map for our project. And then there's also work being done by the Marine Institute and one of the universities over there in Galway. So Oliver Tully, if you know him, he's heading up one of those projects on the West Coast. And just little sample of all the countries and some of the main projects that are being involved in it here. We've yet to be added to this list, but they're going to be doing that in the coming weeks there. And so what we're really doing is reintroducing oysters to some of the native historic habitats. So we had to first find where oysters used to occur, and luckily city councils have these very handy maps that you can overlay. So these are some maps from the 1970s, even as far back as the 1560s actually, of what Ireland maps used to look like overlaid with the current one. And you can see that there are prominent oyster beds that are shown there in Malahide, just there in Clontarf and off of Sutton as well. And indeed, there's been oyster beds that have occurred all the way down the Wicklow, Wexford coast and all around Ireland. So what we have now today is only a handful of oyster beds that are still in production, or healthy wild oyster beds. The largest one would be there in Tralee, down on that coast, but there are also some productive beds along the coastline on the west coast, and then a smaller one down in Cork as well. But the ones that are pictured here on the left are the ones that are a bit more well studied and actually used more for aquaculture. And then on the right there is a paper that just came out showing a lot of the historical presence of oyster reefs throughout Europe and UK. And you can see for Ireland, at least, that the entire coastline used to be covered with oysters, but now we're down to about 5 beds left over on the west coast. So part of my project is to find some of those historic sites and then see if we can identify where the best sites could be to implement restoration and some of these reintroduction efforts for this species. And so that's part of the reason that we're partnering with the EPA on this as an enterprise partner, because they do a lot of that coastal monitoring around Ireland. So this is just a little representation of the data availability that we have here. So the little plus marks there are the historic locations, estimations of where those oysters used to occur. And then the red dots are where we have the EPA monitoring stations for coastal and transitional waters that would be relevant to those oysters. And you can see there in Dublin that we have a nice little cluster of both monitoring stations and historic oyster beds, which is why we're kind of focusing in on this area for the restoration efforts at UCD. And so with all this data, we hope to create some tools for Ireland so that managers can actually look at something that's pretty easy to digest and quickly identify where a restoration effort could occur if they're going to be investing money into it. So these are some examples of some of these habitat suitability index maps that other projects have done for other places in Europe. There's a very zoomed in example there in the bottom right. That's part of the research being done in the North Sea. That'll give you basically a map of where the best location would be to actually do a restoration efforts. A lot of these are very localized to the particular water bodies that they're looking at. The ones that are zoomed out a bit more and give a regional or even international view, like this paper in the top left, they're not at a great resolution for local decision making. So this is kind of gives you a general idea of the red marks being where it is probably very beneficial for oysters to be reintroduced and where they would do well. And so it does cover part of our coastline, but not all of it. But you'll notice there are some white patches in the estuaries and bays, and that's really where the oysters would be reintroduced, is in those kind of smaller inlets of water bodies. And those are harder to get data coverage for at a remote sensing level. So first chapter of my project is really going to be looking at the data that we have available and trying to create a national tool for us to be able to quickly identify where these oysters would do the best if reintroduced to various water bodies. So we've been looking at a lot of that data. We haven't done anything as formalized as this. This will be kind of in the next year or so that we'll be getting some of these tools developed, but kind of just early looking at some of the data. We've chosen a few sites for a pilot project to reintroduce some oysters. So we have some at Malahide, at Poolbeg, and Dunleary. So these were selected based on some background studies and the available EPA data as all being likely suitable for oysters. There haven't been oysters in any of these waters for at least a century at this point, but the environmental conditions lean themselves to be beneficial and suitable for oysters to survive and thrive even. So I can say that we have been able to successfully get some oysters from Kerry over to here. So Tralee is the only place in Ireland where you can source oysters for a reintroduction project like this. One of the reasons why they were historically declining in population is because of a disease that killed off a lot of the native oysters. And Tralee is actually the only place on the West Coast where you can find oysters without this disease. So that's one of the most important reasons why Tralee is an important one, and it is our only source here in Ireland for being able to get oysters to translocate for these reintroduction projects. So we were able to get them and successfully deployed them at those 3 sites November of last year, so almost exactly a year ago at this point, and they have been doing quite well. So I'll be able to talk about some of those results here, but we've had these little oyster garden projects going on for about a year now. And so what those look like is you can kind of see in the top left, there's these little boxes. They'll house the oysters and basically give them a nice protected area that they can grow larger in. And it gives us a way to go and sample them just to see how they're doing. So we're kind of checking them in these marinas. It'd be a setup just like this. So we have 10 of them there in the Dunleary site hanging just off the pontoons. We can pull them up, measure them, get some health metrics on them, and just see how they're doing at each of these sites. So some of our results on that to date here. This is a quick look at some of that EPA data, focusing in on some of the sites that we're working with. So we're looking at kind of Tralee Bay as a reference site for the oysters there, since we know that the conditions there are very, very suitable. And then that's the pink bar there, and then the rest of the bars are the sites that we're looking at in and around Dublin and Fingal County Council areas, and even a little bit further for some. And so we're basically looking at this and showing that they're about along the same lines as Tralee, nothing that's too different. And the lines that you see going straight across are the thresholds set by the kind of International Oyster Restoration Group, that NORA group, for the recommended levels that each of these parameters should be at. So temperature-wise, pH-wise, salinity-wise, it's all looking pretty good. The one that you see a little bit further down there is in Pool Beg, and that makes sense because you get all the fresh water coming in off the Liffey there. But even those ones have been doing better than we expected in response to that fresh water. Other big things, you want to look at nitrogen and phosphorus. That's not a threshold necessarily for oysters, but it is something that causes those big algal blooms and is preventing a lot of those water bodies from reaching that good status under the Water Framework Directive. And that's actually something that oysters can help reduce those numbers if introduced at scale. So they will eat a lot of those phytoplanktons that would be responsible for those algal blooms so that we don't see it hit so hard, especially in those summer months. Oxygen levels, all great. Chlorophyll is kind of the food source of the oysters. That stays plenty for them year round. And then the Secchi depth is kind of a measure of the clarity of the water. And that's just another kind of helpful indicator to see what's going on if we're noticing a big flux in what's happening with the oysters. So this kind of data we have from the EPA since the 90s at all those sites around Ireland, and it's going to be kind of the basis of creating some of those wider tools to identify water bodies that would be suitable for oyster reintroduction efforts. And as far as the oysters that we have out in the gardens right now, they're doing very, very well. So in the top left, mean shell height is one of the main measures, and weight as well for seeing how oysters are growing. So shell height is just basically the length of the oyster from the valve at the bottom, or the hinge at the bottom, sorry, to the valve at the top. So when we reintroduce them, they're all about 80 millimeters across, and we've been seeing significant growth across all of the sites, which has been very, very promising to see. They've gained weights and kind of expectance of what we would want to see as well compared to other projects. And then survivability is where we were really interested to see like how well they would do. Dunleary has very, very high percentages. Malahite's just 1% below that, I think, at the moment. So they're kind of up in the 98, 97 survival rates, which is phenomenal for a reintroduction effort. Like you don't see that in a lot of pilot projects. You see much bigger die-offs usually at the beginning. Pool Beg there is the one where you do see a bit more of a die-off mortality rates. We kind of expected that in the beginning just for the pollutants that you'd see in the Liffey kind of coming down, especially when it rains. and then the freshwater fluxes as well. But right around June, we made some alterations to the boxes to actually get them lower and make sure that they sit in the higher salinity waters that are at the bottom of the Liffey River versus the freshwater ones closer to the top. So we made a few tweaks there, and they've actually been doing much, much better since making those changes in June there. So we haven't seen only a couple more mortalities since then versus the bigger numbers we were seeing before. And just to highlight that, the oyster that you see there on the left, that is one of the pool bag oysters. So the darker parts of the shell that you see at the main body there, that's about the size it was before summer. And then after summer is when we expect a lot of the growth kind of during those summer months is the big growing period. All that light white and purple part of it, that's new growth that happened just over the summer in the pool bag site. So they've been doing very, very well after making a lot of those changes. So we have a lot of those early results there. That's promising for upscaling those projects for the larger piece of the research, which we'll get into in a bit. We've also been able to create these temperature sum curves. So this is a tool that's used by lots of different industries, agriculture as well, for being able to predict when the oysters are going to spawn and when we should start to see settlement of baby oysters for our next generation. So that first gray line across the bottom is where we would expect them to first detect larvae, and that we didn't have any reference for the sites before this. So we kind of put our detectors out to see if we could start to find larvae around then, and we were getting some early results and then able to see max larval densities at that darker line. So that lines up with about early July, about the first, second week in July, with a little variation between the sites. So currently, we're out there trying to see if we did get any settlement of a next generation, because that would be the next big piece, not only to have the oysters out there be able to grow and survive, but also spawn and reproduce and create oyster reefs and oyster beds out in the bay. So that's done by putting out a lot of oyster shell. So this is specific oyster shell that we put out in bags. And then this is an image here in the middle. So you can kind of see those smaller dots on the oyster shell. Those are baby native oysters that did spawn and settle. They're fairly low numbers, which we would expect for the first season, especially since we didn't know exactly when to check them and when to deploy these. We'll have a much better idea of that for next year after we have that temperature sum graph. But even that we got any detection of young native oysters on their shells is a big, big thing. So we'll be out there in about 2 or 3 weeks to see how these have been growing and see how much of these baby oysters, or spat they're called, are growing on these shells. And now quickly, I'm going to go through kind of the bigger project here. So this is kind of our early stages, kind of proof of concept, making sure that the oysters could survive, could grow, and then could also produce oyster larvae. The bigger project here, which we're gearing up for at the moment, is doing these wider spread introductions of oyster beds. So there's a few different ways historically that this is done. So you can take a bunch of oysters and just throw them in the water and hope that they find a place to settle out. That's probably the easiest way to do it, but it's mixed with how successful it is. But there are also these aquaculture methods, which are typically more used around Ireland, especially on the West Coast, since they are still grown for human consumption, and you're able to track the beds a lot more. And that is consisting of growing these oysters in these contained mesh bags, similar to our oyster gardens, but at a much larger scale. And then those will spawn seed oysters that are nearby, and then they'll collect the ones that are growing up in these bags for the human consumption. So you can kind of create these, and then the reef will grow on top of that. Some newer methods, which are kind of a combination of the engineered solutions and nature-based solutions that the other students are working at. So I'm kind of combining some things from both, is creating what are called oyster castles. And these come in a variety of shapes and sizes. They're typically made out of cement or shell material, and then seeded with oysters to kind of create more of that three-dimensional structure along the coastline, and then gives them some protection from predators and gives a nice natural substrate to attract oyster larvae to start creating those reefs. And so what we're working on, or have been working on for all summer, is building these. So we have a nice little production line going up in Malahide. So we have about 50 of these built, and that's what we're going to be using for the first stage of the project. we'll be having these oyster castles that we've made, along with just a control of oysters on culch, which is that shell material again. And then also looking at essentially a lobster pot or some of those traditional aquaculture methods for growing the oysters out there, which are all either a mesh bag or a lobster pot is the easy one that we can purchase as just a ready to go option there. And then particularly looking at our oyster castles to see how much seeding these native oysters on the oyster castles will enhance their ability to grow and reproduce over these kind of more traditional like aquaculture methods. And so we'll be looking at growth and survivability compared across the different methods. We'll also be looking at the reproduction suitability, if there's any enhancements of that, as well as the biodiversity enhancements of having them on an oyster castle versus these other structures here. So the biggest piece of that is doing foreshore licensing, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. So that's been the biggest process over the last year and a half or so. So we've been doing all of our appropriate assessments and to look at some of these sites around Ireland. So here are the sites that we're looking at here. So Rogerstown Estuary, just inside the inlet there. In Malahide, just off the marina on the north side, kind of where that sunken skiff is. There's a nice little place where the oyster beds used to be. So we're going to try to put them down right on where those historic beds were. We're also looking at a couple of deep water sites. So off of Ireland's Eye, there's a nice little area of substrate that we think would be really, really good for them off Ireland's Eye to see if the structures will do well out there in those conditions. And then also looking at a few other places in and around the Dublin coastline. So Dunleary, there's a spot that we have pegged out in the Tolka estuary, and then up there in Sutton where we saw some of those beds, and we've added in Dalkey Island as well. So kind of taking that line of coastline where we've seen those historic beds and identifying some spots around there. So for that, Paul just let me know that he has submitted the application for the foreshore licensing, so that's good to go. It's a very long and expensive process, and we're expecting to get that approved probably by January based on the most recent timelines, and then we'll be deploying a lot of this in March once we get that next oyster season around. So those will be fished in March in Tralee, go through a whole biosecurity protocol to make sure that we're not bringing anything over to our waters on this coast, and then they'll be deployed with those oyster castles and other devices in March. So that's what we're waiting on right now. So we're very excited for that. Okay, so that's my kind of overview of all of that. So thank you for listening. I hope there's some questions that have been piling up in the chat there. We can go through any of those. And these are some of our funding bodies and partners that we've been working with to get all the permissions and those oysters out there. So thank you all. And if there's any questions, we can take those now.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. That was very interesting. It's great to see, like, indeed, some of those first results coming in already as well.
Yeah, exciting for me too. Yeah, on the PhD side.
So I suppose for those that are viewing the webinar, if you have any questions, please just put them in the comments section. I suppose I do have some questions, even just in terms of results you got there for pool bag, because I just noticed that both the growth rates and the weight gain seems to be quite significant. Well, not significant higher, but it's certainly higher.
Yeah, I was actually very, very surprised to see some of those growth rates there. I can just flick back to that, I think, if that's still on the screen. But before summer, we actually were seeing that Dunleary was leading all of them by a little bit. And Pool Bay was actually not seeing a lot of growth at all. But once we made some of those adjustments to how low the baskets were hanging and kind of doing a bit more high resolution tracking at the salinity fluxes that they were getting and kind of like finding that sweet spot to put them in, they just started growing like crazy after that. So that was a big surprise that we've seen a lot of the growth there, but also the most mortalities. So kind of high risk, high reward sort of thing. I think it's potentially there. You do get some kind of mud and silt at the bottom of the Liffey as well, where they're hanging out. And it has been shown that if there is a bit more sediment in the area, along with lots of nutrients, that can be a combination to have them grow faster, because they don't want to get, the oysters themselves typically would not want to get buried in that sediment. So they tend to grow a bit faster, and just to get the shells and feeding organs out of the mud there. A trade-off of that is sometimes they produce less offspring when they're growing that way to kind of get out of the mud. So that's something that we're looking at with the next set of surveys to see if we have any settlement out there and how their reproductive organs are looking in comparison with the other groups.
And in terms of the suitable sort of locations that you were looking at, like in terms of the Malahide Estuary and Sutton or Ireland's Eye, is that then on a gravel sediment, or what makes that site so suitable?
Yeah, so most of the data that we do have is just the water chemistry conditions. So kind of those that I flipped through earlier, looking at all the stuff from the EPA, it had kind of the best sweet spot of reference ones. And then we also have data from Geological Survey Ireland that does show the substrate at a lot of those sites. And so typically they like kind of a mixed gravelly, hard, rocky substrate. So those areas in particular, there is some sand there, but you find some areas, little patchy bits where it's sand, as well as shell and some coarser rock and cobbles, which would be ideal for them.
And is that sort of also, I'm just kind of thinking, as with some of the large scale sort of projects, like, is that something that could be replicated where you actually create like a new gravel bed on the sea?
And that's the idea. So that culture material I kind of mentioned. So culture is just a term used for shell and rock materials combined. And so especially if you have an area that is a bit more muddy, so Malahide would be typically a bit more muddy estuary compared to some of the other sites. If you put that substrate down first and the oysters on top of it, you'll have to kind of reseed it with that shell and culture material for the first few years. But once the oysters start to establish, they actually will change some of that substrate naturally themselves and create the suitable conditions after several years.
So it's more, I suppose, like if you can kickstart the oyster reef, basically, you can, like, after that, it can look after itself.
Yeah, that's the idea. So once you kind of, they usually need some pretty heavily tending to for the first 6 years or so, kind of just reintroducing that culture, making sure that they're doing okay. And then after that, about the 6 to 10 year range is when you start to see them take over and be able to resupply themselves and start growing on their own. So that's part of the idea with the oyster castle as well, is just create that kind of natural like structure. So basically a rock that they'd attach to that gets them off of that muddy surface and then producing a lots of shell material that start to fall off and make that reef bed.
Okay, and like in terms of, I'm just kind of thinking, I'd say like that there are several windmill parks now being proposed, say in the Irish Sea. Is there any scope, for example, for oyster restoration projects to hitch a ride on those projects as well?
Absolutely, yeah. So that's a big thing that's being looked at around Europe. So especially in the North Sea with all of the wind farms that are being done out there, that's probably the main focus of a lot of their research, is how to introduce these oyster beds, and especially things like oyster castles and scouring material at the base of those wind farms to kind of create these natural reefs. That's a big thing that they're looking at. But then we have like Codling Wind Farm and a lot of those groups that are looking in Ireland. So we do have a master's student right now who's working with some of the data that I'm producing and creating some figures and plots for how that might look being introduced to some of those wind farms, because that would be kind of the logical next step if we were able to show some promise with these oyster castles and how they're doing here, is integrating those into the design of shoreline protection and those wind farm bases to kind of create that natural reef around them.
Okay, hey, and just in terms of, I'm just again thinking like this is a small scale, and we can the oysters from Tralee. If say we were to sort of upscale this to like along the east coast, I'm just thinking like all those oyster beds that used to be along Wicklow as well, plus our coast and further north. If you want a lot of the spat, basically, would you actually need some sort of a nursery to kind of set up, or could you keep on importing oysters from Tralee?
Yeah. So Tralee itself doesn't typically have the spat at the scale that we want for a large scale project. Some years are better than others. The last couple, they haven't been getting a ton, but that's a cycle that happens naturally. As some years you'll get lots of recruitment, and then there'll be a cycle of about 2 to 3 years where it's less so, and then it jumps back up for the years following that. So Tralee in itself, would be a good source to start for sure. At a larger scale, extra nurseries that are kind of dedicated to this would be desirable. So that is a part of a project. There's the other group that's working with University of Cork that Paul's involved with as well, kind of early discussions. of what would it take to set up some of these nurseries along our coastline. So once we have a population in and around Dublin that we're working with, we can take those oysters and put them into a nursery, because a single oyster pair can produce, in the right nursery conditions, millions of offspring. So you don't need a ton to start kickstarting that nursery. It's just really getting the permissions to set it up, and then it's mostly that, getting the permissions to set it up, because for research purposes it's a little bit difficult because they treat you as you're trying to set up an aquaculture farm. So there is a policy hurdle to get over with that. But they are working on the ideas of like, can we set up even just temporary nurseries that are seasonal to be able to set these up kind of near Arklow and Wicklow and even Dublin, Malahide area, just as the summer months are coming in, take some of these oysters that we have as adults, put them into the nursery, have them spawn, get a nice controlled environment where you can get millions of spat that are going to be viable versus a couple thousand in the natural environment, and then use those to seed these projects down the line.
Okay. Hey, and in terms of just kind of thinking of the deeper water sites at Ireland's Eye, what sort of communication is required in terms of with the fishing industry around that?
Yeah, for the most part, yeah. So we kind of talk with the fishermen inline, like we go to the ports first, and that's usually our line of communication in with them. They are all very excited for the idea that we've talked to so far. So we've been talking to the Howth port, especially for Ireland's Eye kind of area out and around there. Essentially, you just need to set up some navigation buoys for them, but we're taking into account the normal fishing grounds and kind of the trawling lines that would be around there, and avoiding those areas, because that's at least all mapped out with a lot of the fisheries data. So we're kind of getting a little section in that's been communicated to everyone that it's going to be not affecting their normal fishing routes there.
Okay. Well, I don't know if there's any other questions than that. I don't see anything else come in here. So, well, in that case, if there's no other questions, we'll leave it at that. Listen, Brian, thank you very much for that. That was really interesting, and I'm certainly looking forward, like now, to see this project slowly grow into a full-fledged type of oyster restoration program along our shores. Anyway.
Yeah, we're definitely excited that we have kind of those early promising results, and like this is kind of what we hoped for, to be able to justify upscaling that. So it's a matter of getting those foreshore permissions in, and then just getting kind of the finances to put all this out in the water, because it's going to be a big project, but we're excited to see the results from it.
Okay.
Sorry guys, just to jump in there. Hans, I don't know if you can see the comments tab on the right there. There's actually 3 questions showing up here.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
Can you see those there?
Yeah, no, I can see them. Sorry, like they weren't showing for me there. No, that's fine. Yeah. So
okay, perfect.
We just have a question here, Brian. Sorry. What is the current state of health of the Sutton Creek oyster bed?
So we haven't put oysters into Sutton Creek yet. It's one of those areas that it's a little bit hard to access with the boat, so we haven't surveyed that one as heavily as of yet, but we are looking at it for putting some of these beds in. So no current native oysters there, at least, but that's one that we are looking at to introduce. So I don't have an answer for that right now. I see some other questions there.
Yeah. So beyond water quality, what factors are you looking at as indicators of habitat suitability?
Yeah, so a lot of it's water quality, kind of with the seasons, food availability, which kind of comes from those chlorophyll measurements. Just do they have enough phytoplankton to eat year round? And then indeed the substrate that is down below it. So if it's going to be a muddy area that has a lot of kind of mud and sand input from a river nearby, that's just going to bury them. That's not going to be great. If it's right in the middle of a shipping line or a trawling line, that if we put oysters there, they're just going to get dug up with the next trawl. Avoiding those types of areas for kind of the use for even recreational, like commercial and recreational boats, make sure we're avoiding those areas. And then those are probably and what we would like to incorporate as well as some of the hydrology of the areas, how the water currents move. That's not very well modeled for a lot of nearshore areas. So that's something that we might get a bit more information with this project, or maybe down the line we'll get some of our kind of engineering, like oceanography type of people to get some of those water movement parameters there. But we'll be able to get some early indicators for where the oysters are moving once they spawn from this project as well.
Okay.
But yeah, beyond water quality, probably substrate's the most important one, and then just human use of the area.
Okay.
And yeah, I see you do go just kind of put it there that there might be a residual oyster population there. There is some of the kind of like the little saddle oysters that are there, which is a different species. They'd be in and around there. They grow in all locations because we even get them in and around our areas, but there wouldn't be any of the native oysters there, the ones that we're working with for Sutton Creek.
Okay. And in terms of the lime-rich concrete mix in the construction of the oyster castles, does that affect the growth rates?
It can, yeah. So, but the actual makeup of the cement there is actually fairly important. So we're using kind of the prompt cement mix, if you're familiar with that, and then we're mixing that with a sand mixture that will actually get some of those kind of lime and silica kind of components into it. So overall, it's a fairly low pH that we're working with to help out the oysters, kind of a bit more natural one. But it's definitely the mix of the concrete can have an effect, and that's been something looked at in previous studies that we've built off of for creating the mix for these castles.
Okay. Okay. That's the questions here. If does anybody else have any other question? No, I think we're good. I think we're good. In that case, listen, Brian, thank you very much, and all for those people that are attending. Thank you very much for watching this. We will be uploading this webinar on our Fingal County Council webpage. So I suppose for yourself, if you want to look at it again, or indeed if you think others might be interested, please just let them know. And I wish you all a nice afternoon and a nice weekend. Okay, thank you.
That's great. Thanks for having me.